The sound that tore through the 6 a.m. quiet wasn't thunder. It was the scream of a two-stroke engine, angry and close, too close. I was on my back porch, nursing a cup of coffee, the steam fogging up the cool autumn air. My golden retriever, Leo, was at my feet, his tail thumping a soft rhythm against the wood. It was our time, quiet, still. Let me set the scene for you. My name is Frank. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent the last 30 of those years working with trees. I'm an arborist. I know the language of bark and branch, the secrets of a root system. My little house is tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood called Maple Creek, a place that used to be peaceful. If you're watching Karenology, you probably know that peace never lasts. The chainsaw roared again, this time followed by a sickening crunch. Leo shot to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I put a hand on his back and walked to the edge of the porch. And there they were, in my yard, standing by the great oak that shaded the whole property. There were two of them. Mark, the chairman of our homeowners association, stood with his arms crossed, wearing a crisp polo shirt that was ridiculous for the early morning chill. He had the soft, entitled face of a man who's never done a day of real labor in his life. Next to him was Vince, his pet contractor, a big, sloppy guy with a greasy smirk and a chainsaw in his hands. It was Vince who had just taken a bite out of my tree. I walked down the steps, Leo trotting beside me, the growl still vibrating through his body. The air, which had smelled of damp earth and my coffee, was now thick with the stink of gasoline. "Morning, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "A little early for landscaping, isn't it?" Mark gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just enforcing the community bylaws, Frank. We had a complaint." He held up a small black device. "This audio meter registered a noise disturbance originating from your property at 5:58 a.m. Specifically, a barking dog." I looked down at Leo, who was now just watching them, curious. He was barking at a squirrel. It lasted 10 seconds. "Have you ever owned a dog, Mark?" "The rules are the rules," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "That'll be a $300 fine, but that's not the main reason we're here." He gestured to the oak tree. A fresh white scar gaped from its trunk where Vince had sliced into it. A wound. My blood went cold. That tree had been there for 100 years. My wife, Helen, had loved it. We'd had picnics under it when the kids were small. After she passed, sitting under its branches was one of the few things that brought me any comfort. "This tree," Mark said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "is a hazard. It's clearly diseased. Look at the bark. It doesn't meet the aesthetic code of the neighborhood." "I'm an arborist. I know a sick tree when I see one. And that oak was as healthy as I was. Healthier, probably." "There's nothing wrong with that tree, Mark, and you know it." Vince laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "Looks pretty sick to me, old man." Mark ignored him, his eyes fixed on me. "We can have Vince's crew take it down for you. $2,000. Clean, quick, no fuss. Or, if you want to solve the dog problem and the tree problem at once, you can install a top-of-the-line, sound-dampening privacy hedge. Vince can do that for $5,000. You have 48 hours to decide." I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. This wasn't about a dog or a tree. This was a shakedown. It was extortion, plain and simple, dressed up in the petty tyranny of a homeowners association. In my pocket, my fingers found the cool metal of the small folding branch saw Helen had given me years ago. It was a precision tool, a tool for healing, for carefully removing what was dead to save what was alive. I looked at the brutal gash Vince's chainsaw had left. Then I looked back at Mark's smug face. He thought he had me. He thought he could just roll in, make his threats, and I'd open my wallet like everyone else in this neighborhood did. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They had made it personal. I let their 48-hour clock run down without a word. I didn't call, I didn't write a check, and I sure as hell didn't let Vince and his chainsaw anywhere near my property. I spent the time watching, waiting. I've learned over the years that nature and people reveal their true character under pressure. I wanted to see what their next move would be. What would you have done? Would you have paid up just to make them go away? I got my answer the next morning. The smell hit me before I even opened the door. It was a sharp chemical odor that burned the back of my throat, completely overpowering the sweet scent of fallen maple leaves. I stepped outside and just stared, A wide, ugly yellow-brown scar was burned across my front lawn, stretching from the sidewalk right to my front steps. It looked like someone had painted a river of death on the grass. Taped to my front door was a crisp white envelope from the Homeowners Association. Inside was another fine. This one was for $500. The violation? Failure to maintain landscaping to community standards. The irony was so thick it was almost funny. This was their move. Not a phone call, not another warning. Just straight-up sabotage. This is what happens when you give little men a little bit of power. They don't just want you to obey, they want to see you break. But I don't break, I document. I went back inside, grabbed my soil testing kit, the same one I use for professional consultations, and a dozen sterile sample bags. I walked the perimeter of the scorched earth, my boots sinking into the now mushy turf. I took samples from the dead zone, from the edges where the grass was still fighting, and from the healthy lawn nearby for a baseline. Each bag was sealed, labeled with the precise location and time. Evidence. Then I dealt with the audio file. I called the main number for the Homeowners Association. After a 10-minute journey through an automated phone tree, a bored-sounding receptionist answered. I told her I wanted a copy of the audio evidence for the barking fine. "All disputes must be submitted in writing," she droned, her voice flat and lifeless. "This isn't a dispute," I said, keeping my own voice level. "This is a request for the evidence you use to levy a fine. According to your own bylaws, I'm entitled to it." There was a long pause. I could hear her typing. I guess she didn't expect anyone to have actually read the 300-page book of rules they mailed out every year. "Fine," she sighed, her voice filled with the agony of someone being forced to do their job. "What's your email?" The file arrived a few minutes later. The subject line just read, "Evidence." I clicked play. It was a disaster. A poorly edited 10-second clip of a dog barking. It was loud, harsh, and clearly looped. The background noise was a digital hiss, not the morning birds and distant traffic of our neighborhood. And the bark. I've had Leo since he was a pup. I know his voice better than my own. That wasn't my dog. This is where it gets interesting. They were sloppy. They thought I was just some old guy they could push around. They didn't count on me knowing my way around more than just trees. I opened the audio file in an editing program, not to change it, but to look at its properties, the metadata, the file's digital fingerprint. And there it was, plain as day. The file hadn't been created on some generic office computer. The metadata showed it was last modified on a specific model of smartphone, a fairly new one, but that wasn't the kicker. The file also contained a ghost of a GPS tag, a tiny fragment of location data that hadn't been fully scrubbed. It was a single set of coordinates, pointing to a spot less than 50 feet from my own property line. It was the exact location of Vince's house. Armed with soil samples and a digital smoking gun, I went to the next Homeowners Association meeting. Let me tell you, these meetings are a special kind of theater. They're held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smells of air freshener and quiet desperation. A dozen of my neighbors were there, sitting on uncomfortable folding chairs, their faces a mixture of boredom and fear. Mark ran the meeting like a petty dictator, his voice booming with false authority. He droned on about lawn maintenance, acceptable shades of beige for exterior paint, and the mortal sin of leaving your trash cans out for more than 2 hours after pickup. Every new pronouncement was met with meek, nervous nods. These people weren't just neighbors, they were hostages. When he opened the floor for community concerns, I stood up. All eyes turned to me. You could feel the air in the room change. It went from tense to electric. "Frank," Mark said, his smile tight and condescending. "So glad you could join us. I trust you've decided on a course of action regarding your landscaping issues." "I have," I said, my voice ringing out in the quiet room. "I'm here to discuss fraud." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Mark's face hardened. "That's a very serious accusation." "It is," I agreed. "Let's start with this." I held up my phone and hit play. The distorted, looping bark filled the room. It was comically loud, comically fake. "This is the evidence used to fine me $300. It's a doctored audio file, and the metadata proves it was created on Vince's phone, from his property." A murmur rippled through the neighbors. I saw a few of them exchange glances. Vince, who was leaning against the back wall, turned a shade of purple. Mark didn't flinch. "Technical glitches happen," he said smoothly. The point remains, your dog was a nuisance. And my lawn, I pressed on. Was that a technical glitch too? Or was it Vince's crew spraying my property with industrial-grade herbicide in the middle of the night? I held up one of the sealed sample bags. I have the proof. It's being analyzed at a lab as we speak. This time, the murmur was louder. I had their attention. But then Mark played his card. He stepped away from the podium and gestured to a large screen on the wall. An image flickered to life. It was a beautiful, computer-generated rendering of a park, manicured lawns, neat little flower beds, a sterile-looking playground. "Friends, neighbors," Mark began, his voice now filled with a visionary's passion. "I know there have been disagreements, but it's because we have a vision for this community, a vision of progress. We have a plan to create a beautiful new eco-park right here in Maple Creek, a place for our children to play safely." He clicked a button and the image zoomed in. My stomach dropped. The park was located exactly where my property stood, and right in the center, where my 100-year-old oak tree should have been, there was an empty patch of grass. "Of course," he continued, his eyes sweeping the room, "to make way for this progress, some sacrifices must be made. We have to clear out the old, the diseased, the hazardous." He looked directly at me. "Some of the older trees, like the one on Frank's property, are a danger to our community. They have to go." And just like that, he flipped the script. I was no longer a victim of his shakedown. I was the selfish old man standing in the way of progress. The guy who cared more about his diseased tree than the safety of children. I saw it in their faces. The doubt. The shift in allegiance. He was offering them a shiny new park, and all it would cost was my home. He even had the gall to use a personal tragedy against me. "We all know Frank has been through a lot," he said, his voice dripping with fake pity. "Sometimes, when people are grieving, they become attached to things. They can't see the bigger picture." It was a masterclass in manipulation. I felt a surge of pure, white-hot rage. He was using my wife's memory, my grief, as a weapon. While I was focused on his petty crimes, the fake audio, the poison lawn, he was playing a much bigger game. He wasn't just trying to get a few $1,000s out of me. He was trying to take everything. I glanced over at Vince. He was no longer leaning against the wall. He was standing straight, a smug look on his face, and he was scratching his hands. I noticed it then, a faint red rash covering the backs of both his hands, a detail that seemed trivial, but my gut told me it was a thread. I just had to figure out where it led. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I'd been run over by a truck. The anger was still there, a hot coal in my gut, but it was mixed with a cold, creeping sense of dread. Mark hadn't just deflected my accusations, he'd turned the entire neighborhood against me. I was the enemy now, the crazy old widower who couldn't let go. I spent the next few days in a fog. Every time I looked out my window, I saw my neighbors whispering to each other, their eyes darting towards my house. The friendly waves stopped. The casual hellos over the fence disappeared. It was like I had become a ghost in my own community. Have you ever felt that? That chilling sense of being completely and utterly alone, even when you're surrounded by people. Then the lab results for the soil samples came back. I opened the email, my heart pounding. The report was dense, full of chemical names and parts per million I knew all too well. It confirmed my suspicions, but it also revealed something far more sinister. The herbicide used on my lawn wasn't just a common weed killer you could buy at a hardware store. It was a highly aggressive, specialized compound. It was designed to do one thing: attack the root systems of mature hardwood trees. The picture was starting to come into focus. They weren't just trying to make my lawn look bad. They were trying to kill my oak tree from the ground up, slowly and secretly. That way, when it finally started to die months later, Vince could point to it and say, "See, I told you it was sick." It was a long con, patient, diabolical. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. A lab report wasn't going to sway a neighborhood that had already been promised a shiny new park. I needed something more. I needed to understand the how. That's when I thought of George. George is a plumber, a local guy who's been working in this town for 30 years. He's one of those old-school tradesmen who knows the history of every pipe, valve, and sewer line in a 5-mile radius. He's what you'd call the eyes and ears of the community. I gave him a call. "George," I said, "it's Frank. Got a strange question for you." There are no strange questions in my line of work, Frank. Only strange things pulled out of drains. He chuckled. What's on your mind? The storm drains in Maple Creek, I said. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? There was a pause on the other end of Theline. Funny you should ask, he said, his tone shifting from jovial to serious. Been having a hell of a time over there for the past 6 months. The main line on your cul-de-sac keeps getting clogged. And it's not the usual stuff. Leaves, trash, you know. It's this thick, fibrous mass. Almost looks like, well, it looks like roots, but I've never seen anything like it. Grows like crazy. My mind flashed back to the meeting, the 3D rendering of the park, the perfectly manicured green lawns, and then the image of Vince scratching at the angry red rash on his hands, a contact rash, a chemical burn. George, I said slowly, a plan forming in my mind. Can you get me a sample of that stuff? The fibrous mass from the drain. Sure, he said. I've got a bucket of it in the back of my truck. Smells terrible. Why? I think I know what it is, I said, and I think it's the key to everything. I met George at a diner a half hour later. He handed me a sealed plastic container. Inside was a clump of tangled pale white fibers coated in a slimy film. It looked alien. Unnatural. I took it straight back to my workshop, the little shed behind my house where I keep my microscopes and testing gear. I placed a small piece of the fibrous material on a slide and put it under the lens. I adjusted the focus, the world shrinking down to a single, illuminated circle. It was exactly what I suspected. Roots. But not from a tree. They were the aggressive, fast-growing roots of a specific type of ornamental grass, a cheap, invasive species often used by unscrupulous landscapers to create a lush lawn effect quickly. A species whose growth is supercharged by the exact chemical compound I'd found in my soil. Vince wasn't just poisoning the trees. He was seeding the entire neighborhood with a botanical cancer, a hidden plague that was choking the life out of the ground beneath our feet. The storm drains were just the first symptom. He was creating a problem that only he could be paid to solve. I had the science, I had the connection, the poisoned soil, the doctored audio, the invasive roots choking the town's arteries. It was all one big dirty scheme. Vince was the architect of the disease, and Mark was the salesman for the cure. A cure that involved bulldozing my property and handing out fat contracts to his crony. I thought, this is it. This is the proof that blows it all wide open. I spent that night compiling everything into a single damning report. I included the lab results, the audio metadata analysis, the magnified photos of the roots from the storm drain, and a detailed explanation of how the chemical was both killing the trees and causing the invasive grass to grow out of control. It was airtight. The next morning, I posted the entire report on a local community gardening blog. It was a small site, but well respected among people who actually knew a thing or two about plants. I figured it was a way to get the information out there without it being immediately shot down by Mark in the official Homeowners Association channels. For a moment, I actually felt a flicker of hope. And for a few hours, it worked. The post started getting traction. People were sharing it. The comments were a mix of shock and outrage. I knew something was wrong with my lawn, one person wrote. My water bills have been sky high, said another. The tide was turning. I was winning. That's when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Is this Frank? A young, nervous voice asked. It is. Who's this? My name's Alan, he said. I'm a lawyer. I live 2 streets over. I saw your blog post. This is huge. Mark can't get away with this. I want to help, pro bono. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel so alone. A lawyer, a young, eager kid who wanted to fight. It felt like a sign. We talked for an hour, and he was sharp. He saw all the angles. He suggested we file a formal complaint with the county's Environmental Protection Division and explore a class action lawsuit on behalf of the residents. Hope wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was a flame. And then, just as quickly, they poured gasoline on it. By that evening, my blog post was a war zone. It was flooded with hundreds, then thousands of negative comments. They were all variations on the same theme. This guy is a crazy conspiracy theorist. He's just bitter because his house is a mess. He's putting our property values at risk with these lies. It was a coordinated bot attack, a digital firestorm designed to bury the truth under an avalanche of slander. My reputation, which was already hanging by a thread, was being systematically shredded online. The next morning, the real blow came. I got a text from Alan, the young lawyer. "Frank, I'm so sorry. I have to back out." I called him immediately. "What happened?" He sounded terrified. "Mark found out I was talking to you. He called me. He said if I didn't drop it, he'd sue me for defamation. He said he knows things about me, things from my past. Frank, I have a family, a career. I can't—" His voice trailed off. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. I felt the cold hand of betrayal clench around my heart. Have you ever put your trust in someone, only to have them pull it away when you needed it most? It's a unique kind of pain. But the final act of their little play was yet to come. Later that day, a shiny white truck from the county environmental office pulled up in front of my house. A man in a crisp uniform got out, holding a clipboard. He marched right up to my oak tree, spent about 30 seconds looking at it, and then started writing. He walked to my front door and taped an official-looking notice to it. It was an order, an emergency removal order. The notice, signed by a lead inspector, declared my tree an imminent public hazard, citing advanced root rot and canopy decay. It stated that if the tree was not removed within 24 hours, the county would remove it and bill me for the cost. I knew the inspector was a fake. I knew the order was fraudulent, but it had a county seal on it. It looked real. To my neighbors, it was the final nail in my coffin. I wasn't just a crank anymore. I was a man who was officially, legally endangering them all. I stood there on my porch, the fake order in my hand, and looked out at the street. Everything seemed to go quiet. I was out of moves. They had beaten me. That was the lowest point. Standing there, with a fraudulent county order in my hand, watching the clock tick down on my tree's life. I felt the full weight of my 58 years. I was tired of fighting, tired of being the villain in a story I didn't write. For a long moment, I thought about just letting them win, letting them bring in their chainsaws and their bulldozers and turn a century of life into a pile of wood chips. It would be easier. I went inside and sat in my old armchair, the one Helen always used to read in. I could almost smell her perfume, a faint hint of lavender. I looked out the window at the great oak, its branches reaching for the sky like old gnarled arms. It had been a silent witness to my entire life in this house. It had shaded my children's first steps, caught their kites, held their swings. It had been a constant, a quiet giant that was part of the family. And I was going to let these two-bit crooks kill it. My hand went to my pocket, to the familiar cold steel of my folding saw, the one with Helen's initials, a tool for healing, for pruning the dead wood to let the living parts thrive. And that's when it hit me. I'd been fighting this battle all wrong. I was trying to fight their lies with my truth. I was trying to show people a complicated disease when all they wanted was a simple answer. I needed to stop talking about the problem. I needed to show them the consequence. The idea was so simple, so direct. It was almost stupid, but it was the only move I had left. The key wasn't the herbicide in the soil or the roots in the drain. It was the water, the lifeblood of any community, the thing everyone takes for granted until it's gone, or until it shows up where it's not supposed to. Vince's invasive grass wasn't just killing my tree. It was strangling the whole neighborhood's drainage system. The town was like a patient with hardening arteries. Sooner or later, it was going to have a heart attack. All I had to do was give it a little stress test. I got up from the chair, a new energy surging through me. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I had a plan. First, I called George, the plumber. "George, I need a favor," I said. "A big one, and I need you to trust me." I explained what I needed him to do. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the gears turning in his head. "Frank," he said finally, "if you're wrong about this, we could both be in a world of trouble." "I'm not wrong," I said, "and if I am, I'll take the fall for it. All of it." "All right," he said, "I'm in, but you owe me, big time." Next, I went to my workshop. I grabbed a 5-gallon bucket and a large container of industrial-grade, water-soluble, non-toxic blue dye, the kind surveyors use to trace water flows. It was harmless, but it was incredibly vibrant. It stained everything it touched a shocking, impossible shade of blue. The final piece of the puzzle was the timing. I looked at the community calendar. The annual Maple Creek Autumn Harvest Fair was tomorrow. The whole neighborhood would be there. It was the perfect stage. Mark would be there, no doubt, giving some self-congratulatory speech about his vision for the community. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my porch, watching the moon move across the sky, my old folding saw in my hand. It wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It was a promise. Helen had given it to me to fix things. And that's what I was going to do. I was going to cut out the rot. The next day, one way or another, this was going to end. The only question was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? The harvest fair was in full swing. The air was filled with the smell of popcorn and grilled hot dogs, the sounds of children laughing, and a local band butchering a classic rock song. The whole neighborhood was gathered on the great lawn of the community park. And there, on a small stage, was Mark, microphone in hand, beaming like a king addressing his loyal subjects. He was in the middle of a speech about community investment and a bright future. I could see Vince standing near the stage, arms crossed, looking smug. They thought they had won. The 24-hour notice on my tree was set to expire in a few hours. This speech was their victory lap. I waited until Mark paused for applause. Then I walked towards the stage. I wasn't carrying a sign or shouting. I was just carrying a 5-gallon bucket. The crowd parted as I walked, a wave of whispers following me. "Frank, what is the meaning of this?" Mark barked into the microphone, his smile vanishing. "This is a private event." "This is a community event, Mark," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry. "And I have a community concern." I stopped next to the large, elaborate flower bed right in front of the stage. A flower bed installed by Vince's company, filled with his signature, unnaturally green grass. "You've been talking a lot about your vision for the future. I'd like to give everyone a little preview of what that future actually looks like." Before he could stop me, I tipped the bucket over. A torrent of brilliant electric blue water poured onto the grass, soaking the soil. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The water disappeared into the turf almost instantly. "What have you done?" Mark shrieked. "You've destroyed the landscaping. That's vandalism." "It's non-toxic dye, Mark," I said, setting the empty bucket down. "Just water and food coloring. Now we wait." We all stood there in a strange, silent tableau. The band had stopped playing. The kids had stopped laughing. Every eye was fixed on the patch of wet grass. For about 30 seconds, nothing happened. I could feel the doubt creeping back into the crowd. I saw Mark exchange a triumphant look with Vince. And then it began. From a storm drain grate about 20 feet away, a small trickle of blue appeared. It wasn't flowing into the drain, it was flowing out. A thin blue line at first, then a steady stream, pooling on the pavement. The ground couldn't absorb the water because the drainage system was completely clogged with Vince's invasive roots. The water had nowhere else to go. I pointed to the growing blue puddle. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is your future. That's a 5-gallon demonstration. What do you think happens when we get a real autumn storm? When 2 inches of rain fall in an hour? Where do you think all that water is going to go?" I let the question hang in the air. "It's going into your basements. It's going to flood your homes." Suddenly, a loud horn blast cut through the air. A large county utility truck, the kind used for sewer maintenance, pulled up to the curb. George hopped out of the driver's seat, holding a clipboard. He wasn't acting. He was on the clock. "Got a call about a major blockage in the main drain line," he announced to the crowd. He looked at the blue puddle, then at Mark. "Looks like we found it." He turned to a younger man who followed him out of the truck. "All right, son, let's show these folks what's clogging up their neighborhood." His assistant fed a camera snake down a manhole. A moment later, the image appeared on a large monitor mounted on the side of the truck. The screen showed the inside of a massive pipe, almost completely choked with a thick, tangled web of pale roots, all stained a shocking, vibrant blue. The game was over. The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. They were shouting. All their little problems, the soggy lawns, the high water bills, the strange smells from the drains, it all clicked into place. They weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much larger disease. They were looking at the proof. Mark stood on the stage, his face as white as a sheet. He tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the angry roar of the neighbors. I didn't stick around to watch the fallout. I just turned and walked away. In the end, Mark and his entire board were forced to resign. The county launched a full investigation, and Vince's company was hit with massive fines and lost its license. The new homeowners association, led by some of the very people who had booed me at that first meeting, had to take out a huge loan to replace the entire drainage system. They offered to make me the head of a new tree committee. I politely declined. I'd had enough of committees to last a lifetime. My victory didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like quiet. The threats were gone, the fight was over. But it came at a cost. My quiet life was gone too. I was that guy, the one who took on the HOA and won. A few days later, I was on my porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Leo was snoozing at my feet. My old oak tree stood tall, its leaves rustling in the breeze, a single, healing scar on its trunk. I had saved it. But I knew things would never be quite the same. Sometimes, to save what you love, you have to become something you're not. You have to get loud. I guess that's the price of peace. And if you've ever had to fight for what's yours, maybe you'll hit that like button and let me know I'm not alone. It's a fight worth having.